In Twilight Struggle, part of the transition from beginner to intermediate skill level is understanding the timing of the reshuffles of the event deck. Today we will take a look at this interesting dynamic and show you how to take advantage of it here on Legendary Tactics. In most games, when a deck is exhausted, it is simply reshuffled and flipped over without much thought or fanfare. But Twilight Struggle is different, and because of the structure of its design, there is some necessary strategy in understanding reshuffles. The first thing to grasp is that there will always be a reshuffle of the event cards in turn 3, and most times in turn 7, and once in a long while right before the last turn, turn 10, but we'll get into that part later. It's important to note that this reshuffle happens immediately when the event cards run out. That is why we know there will be a reshuffle on turn 3. There are 7 cards that are dealt out each hand in the early war, but there are only 35 cards in the deck at that point, plus 3 if you're using the optional cards. So a reshuffle on turn 3 is something that you can and should plan for. Turn 7 will usually be the next reshuffle. This is not a guarantee, as there are cards like Ask Not What Your Country Can Do For You and Our Man in Tehran, in addition to how the China card is used in the first 7 turns, that can affect exactly when that reshuffle happens. But since the reshuffle happens most often on turn 7, let's assume for the sake of argument that that's the case for our analysis. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means that cards that are discarded on or after turn 3 usually won't have a chance to return until after turn 7's reshuffle, and cards discarded after turn 7 typically will not return to the game. To put all this in another way, all early war event cards will have been drawn in the first 3 turns, and any card played or discarded in turn 1 or turn 2 will be guaranteed to be drawn again at some point between turns 3 and 7. This can be dangerous in that safely discarding a strong opponent's event card in turn 1 or 2 might be back in play as soon as turn 3, a most unacceptable possibility. All the mid-war cards which are shuffled into the event deck on turn 4 will be drawn between turns 4 and 7. Any card played or discarded between turns 3 and 6 has a chance of coming back in turns 7 to 10. So in a similar manner to what was mentioned earlier about the early war, a nasty opponent's card discarded in turn 6 has a chance of coming back as soon as turn 7, which is usually, to put it simply, bad. The late war cards act a bit differently. These are shuffled into the event deck on turn 8 and may or may not even turn up between turns 8 and 10. This is why they made a late war variant to Twilight Struggle, as many players felt they don't usually get much of a chance to give these cards a spin, especially as many games finish before turn 8. And after turn 7, as mentioned earlier, unless you get one of those unusual games where there's a reshuffle on turn 10, a discarded or played card at that juncture is likely gone for the rest of the game. From a big picture standpoint, this means that if you have the opportunity to discard an important opponent's event, via the space race for example, do it on turn 3 and or turn 7, so you won't have to deal with those events for a while, if at all. As an interesting aside, if the turn 7 shuffle doesn't happen because there are still a handful of cards in the draw deck, the reshuffle will likely happen on turn 9 or 10 instead. This unusual situation happens because the late war cards are added and shuffled into the draw deck in turn 8, resulting in an interesting game state where the draw deck is almost entirely made up of late war cards. If that happens, players will certainly notice a different feel to the last part of the game. So which cards are most important for each side to discard after the reshuffle? Well, in the early war, for the USSR, you were looking at cards like Marshall Plan here. If you can kick the Marshall Plan can down the road to the mid-war or beyond, it renders it a much less effective event than in the early war. For the US, the classic tactic is to hold on to the 2 most dangerous Soviet events of the early war, decolonization and de-Stalinization, until after the turn 3 reshuffle, before sending them to space. While decolonization is always a disagreeable event for the US, de-Stalinization hurts a lot less later on in the game. To get rid of these events, one can either use the space race, UN intervention, or to offset tricky events like blockade at little cost. In fact, one of my favorite plays in Twilight Struggle is, as the US, taking the opportunity to discard de-Stalinization to pay for the blockade event on turn 3 in a lovely 2-for-1 deal. Similarly, in the mid-war, if there are events that are particularly unwelcome, hold them until at least turn 7 so that they have little chance of occurring. The reason why I say there is still a small chance of event cards coming back after reshuffles is because of the pair of cards that allow recursion, Salt Negotiations and Star Wars. These cards are also affected by the reshuffle schedule, as they depend on having a robust discard pile to draw from. Playing Salt Negotiations, for example, on turn 4 or 7 will be much less effective than it would be in turn 6, as the draw pile will be small or even non-existent. And Star Wars will be most effective for the US on turn 10, and perhaps a safe play for the Soviets on turn 8, although this would rely on some luck in having a completely desirable discard pile at that moment. Also of note here is that the Our Man in Tehran event is also affected by the reshuffle, but in reverse. It is best used when the draw pile is healthy, like right after the reshuffle on turn 7. I have come across some articles online where they discuss manipulating the timing of the reshuffle. While this can certainly change the dynamic of the game, I'm not sure how feasible it would be to build this into your regular gameplay, as it depends on a lot of variables. For example, a reshuffle could be forced in turn 6 if there have been a lot of cards drawn and discarded, like, for example, by using the maximum discard capability of Our Man in Tehran and Ask Not What Your Country Can Do For You. Presumably you would rush the reshuffle if you wanted the scoring cards back in the deck to hopefully score regions before the tide turns there, or to somehow end the game sooner. There may also be some events that you would like to see back in play sooner than later. The advantage of delaying a reshuffle, if you can possibly engineer it, is to buy time to catch up in some regions before the scoring cards re-enter gameplay. But ultimately, the reshuffle will happen when it happens, and it happens on turn 7 almost all of the time, so I would build a strategy around that assumption instead. So in summary, use the reshuffles on turn 3 and 7 carefully and wisely. Hold on to your opponent's events until after a reshuffle to minimize their effect, and be aware of how and when the mid or late war cards enter the game. I hope you found this Twilight Struggle strategy video helpful. If you did, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe down below, and thank you for watching. We'll see you here next time on Legendary Tactics.